Wouldn't it be cool if you just type an English text and get back the data that you have in your PostgreSQL or pretty much any SQL or relational databases that Prisma.js has a connection to? Today we are going to build simple Next.js application with Tailwind CSS to beautiful UI that essentially takes a ChatGPT prompt text, asks to make an SQL query, and then extract the data using simple Prisma query out of our database connection. And that will give you overall idea how to build ChatGPT based applications on top of your existing data and how you can manipulate that later on when you develop production ready projects. So let's jump into it. I named this project Prompt.GPT because technically we are using Prisma.js with ChatGPT, which sounds fantastic in a way. To start things up, I'm making a standard Next.js application using create next app and just checking all of the usual stuff like selecting TypeScript, ESLint, and of course Tailwind CSS for making basic styling. The first thing I usually do is to remove a standard code generated by the project template inside the homepage page tsx. Then that allows me to start from scratch and make a Tailwind components without mixing them with the existing styling. I'll add the base container div with a full height and flex column direction to center everything we have on a page. Now we have our title text centered with our page, and we can add text area component for typing an actual prompt that we will use later on to deliver a text from our UI to ChatGPT API endpoint. I'm setting rows and columns for text area because we need some space to see our few lines of text that will be using as a typing questions to ChatGPT API. We have a Next.js app router project here, which means we can't use React effects or state management inside an actual page server component, so we have to move our text area to the new component named prompt form and add a button with a real form to submit a prompt to server action delivered by Next.js. To complete this component, we need some states for our prompt text, input, loading state, and an error text that we should have to display an API errors. The critical part is to make fancy button loading state and disable the button while loading data from the server so that user can submit the same form 2 times clicking on the same button while data is still loading. The prompt form component should use an external onSubmit server action from Next.js server action experimental feature. We must define it over properties and handle the submission with the loading indication and error handling. Now I have to define the server action function inside the page.tsx file, which will be executed only on server, and Next.js will handle all the complex async requests to the server. This experimental feature must be enabled manually from Next.js configuration. Since the release of the day, I've been using this experimental feature because it makes the code base much cleaner. Now that we have the flow working over server actions to UI error message and button loading itself, it is time to start setting up Prisma.js with a database connection. The process of adding Prisma to Next.js project is straightforward. Simply, it just installing Prisma CLI for development and build strategies and Prisma client to utilize an actual functionality to connect into database inside Next.js TypeScript code base. Prisma has a little tweak with Next.js to define a database connection consistently. We make a database connection once and then keep that client inside the global variable of Node.js to ensure that Next.js is not trying to connect to our database every single time when we try to use a Prisma client instance. For the Prisma schema, I'll use an SQLite connection to define things easy for development, and it doesn't really matter if you define a Prisma schema correctly. You can just use pretty much any database that they support, if you don't have a database specific queries, of course. But in our case, that's simply just having a straight database connection and executing the queries with row. So we don't care that much. I'm just setting up the SQLite just for ease of use. I'll define only one model for having one table in our database to keep things very simple. Our task model is going to have just a title, text field, and a boolean done column. This is very poorly designed to do app model for sure, but after making a Prisma database push and Prisma generate, we will have the usable database table that we can work with, especially if we don't have that much data to keep anyway. To make sure things are working correctly, let's add a few tasks to our database by just using WebStorm's visual editor and head back to server action function inside page.tsx just to select all the tasks that we just added from WebStorm's UI and deliver them through Prisma client to the UI by just looping over the names. Apparently, there is a naming error for our model, and Prisma.task goes to other function that Prisma object has by default. So I have to rename this model to something else like to do and generate Prisma client again. Now, after changing the types and adding new rows to the database, we have a proper response from our server action listing all the task items in our SQLite database. It is finally time to connect OpenAI ChatGPT functionality to query our database's data from UI prompts. I'll use a standard npm install OpenAI library to connect to OpenAI ChatGPT API instead of other popular options like LangChain, because we don't have any functionality other than just prompting to ChatGPT, so we don't need any extra large libraries to execute ChatGPT prompts. To make an OpenAI API calls, I have to generate new token inside OpenAI's platform and put that into environment variables that we have in .env root folder. We can test the run prompt function by just passing our text prompt from the UI directly to ChatGPT message argument and respond with the first message option we got from OpenAI's API. Now that things seem to be working, it is time to add the final database connection by writing an intelligent prompt for the SQL code generation for ChatGPT. The key ingredient here is to write predefined prompt text and pass the Prisma schema to ChatGPT message history so that GPT large language model will respond with an SQL query that is going to be the answer for our original UI text prompt that we want to query our SQL database. When we test this, we see that ChatGPT responds with an SQL that we want, but it also types a whole lot explanation on how he come up with that SQL query and how to use it. So we don't need that. We must return a plain SQL query to that over Prisma client and execute that. To make sure that ChatGPT gets back only a specific SQL query without any other text, we're just going to type as a ChatGPT prompt explanation, like respond with an SQL query only. That essentially safeguards us for getting back any other external text that ChatGPT might generate. Finally, it is time to pass the SQL query response from ChatGPT to Prisma row client query and return the resulting object array to a basic JSON stringify to just display that on our UI, because we don't have any object parsing on the UI side and we don't really need at the moment. It will be just fine to respond with stringified JSON. We will just understand that. This code base is just a fundamental implementation. It is not near to universally usable. For example, if I type to mark all tasks done with a specific title, it actually marks entire database tasks as done. So it generates update query wrong. So we end up corrupting our data. So this is really important, that you can't really use this script to your production database, because essentially ChatGPT might respond with any query and corrupt your data or even remove it. I hope you got an idea of how to make a simple Q&A app on top of the existing data that you have in your database, or pretty much any document you can use to ingest data and provide a prompt to use it. It all boils down to asking ChatGPT to generate a useful SQL queries from natural language processing and execute them using whichever database client you are using. That's it for this simple project. Hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe.